we are really lucky today because we, as in myself and you, the audience, are joined by James Holland, the renowned author of so many works on the Second World War that we've already enjoyed. In fact, because you've covered every domain in which the war is fought, this is the absolutely perfect opportunity for us to tackle the question about how the war was won and why the Allies won. So, James, enormously grateful for you joining us. I'm sure
it's a pleasure, Peter.
Thank you very much.
Sort of collapsed off the thing. My chair's literally just collapsed. Hold on, I'm just gonna go and get a different chair, okay? Because otherwise I'm in danger of sort of sinking off the screen. Hold on one moment, everyone. I won't be a second.
All right. But okay, so while James sorts out his chair-related problems, I will just let you know about a little bit more that's coming up.
Fortunately, here's one I prepared earlier, which is non-collapsible. There you are. That's better. Sorry, Peter. Sorry, everyone.
No worries. Fantastic. Well, let's dive in. Obviously, the question around which we are currently structured is why the Allies won. And so, James, I think all the very lovely people who've joined us from Berkhamsted, the Netherlands, Portsmouth, two from Berkhamsted, wow, Dunblane, Warwick, everybody wants to hear your answer to that. So by all means, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you, Peter. I think it's important to understand that let's deal with Europe first and Nazi Germany and the Axis powers in the West. So the interesting thing about Germany is Germany throughout history, Prussia before it was Germany in 1871, because of its landlocked nature in the center of Europe, it's very resource poor. It's got a bit of coal, but it hasn't got much iron ore, hasn't got any tungsten, bauxite. Agriculture is behind the times, so it's short of food. It's got quite a big population, about 85 million in 1940. So it's a largest population of a single entity in Europe in 1939. It hasn't got much access to the sea. It's got a little bit of the Baltic, but the Baltic is a bit of a kind of mishmash of narrow channels, islands, and all the rest of it. It doesn't really get you into the world's oceans. It's got a stretch of the North Sea, the other side of the Denmark Peninsula. But again, it's not the same as being France or Spain or Britain or America or any of these countries, which are just absolutely back straight onto large oceans. So it's got a problem on its hands. So traditionally, Germany has always fought very fast, quick wars, and it is won a sort of military reputation by attacking with enormous force at the main point of attack, which is known in German parlance as the Schwerpunkt, and then doing what's called a Kattelschlag, which is effectively the cauldron war. So what you do is you just envelop your enemy and destroy them. And you do all this really quickly. And actually, this modus operandi, you can take it all the way back to Frederick the Elector, certainly to Frederick the Great. You can certainly take it back to 1864 and the war against Austria. You can take it against the war against Denmark in 1866. You can take it against the war against France in 1870. You can also take it to 1914. They're doing exactly the same thing. And nothing has changed in 1939 and 1940 in the Blitzkrieg years. They're doing exactly the same thing, to the extent that the main crossing point, when they cross over on the 13th of May, 1940, into France, across the River Meuse, is exactly the same crossing point that German soldiers crossed in 1870 and again in 1914. So there is the concept of the von Manstein plan, for example, is not particularly original at all. You know, they've repeatedly done it. And the reason they have to do this is they have to win quick, because the moment they get into a long, drawn-out attritional war, odds on they're going to lose, because they can't compete with other major powers who have access to the world's oceans and therefore world supplies. And that is the big problem facing Nazi Germany. And obviously, to start off with,
James, on that note then, do you think that as soon as, France was knocked out of the war in 1940, or at least with the fall of France, do you feel that as soon as there's not a separate peace signed with Britain, is Germany doomed to failure from that point onwards?
The moment it doesn't defeat Britain in the summer of 1940, the odds are rapidly diminishing. I think just to go back a step to France, I mean, this is why Britain and France enter the war with a certain amount of confidence. They know they've got a bit of catching up to do in terms of their kind of armaments industry. But they also know that in terms of supplies, Germany is weak. And so therefore, if they can just hold their ground, hold on until they're ready, then they can counterattack and defeat Nazi Germany. That's the plan. What, of course, all goes awry is when Germany overwhelms France. And suddenly one of the kind of, I know superpower is a term that comes post-war, but France is, by today's standards, a superpower in 1940. When France, which has a larger army than Germany, has double the number of artillery pieces, has more tanks, better tanks, has literally parity aircraft, when France folds, that is just a gargantuan shock. The reason why France folds is kind of 50-50. It's 50 because of German brilliance and it's 50 because of French mistakes. The big mistake that France has is that it doesn't have good comms, doesn't have good communications. What is different about 1940 compared to 1914 or 1870 or, time immemorial is harnessing of the Luftwaffe in what we would now call a tactical air force, a close air support mode. So the RAF develops in terms of strategic air forces which are designed to operate on their own. So that's a strategic air force, as opposed to a tactical air force, which is there to designed to support ground operations. Whereas the Germans, organically, because their focus has always been continental and they're a bunch of landlubbers, and because they're thinking in terms of the ground battle, the Luftwaffe has grown since 1935 organically as what we would now term as a tactical air force, and delivering close air support. So that is a big difference that they don't have in 1914, for example. The second thing they have is although actually Germany is not particularly automotive in 1939. It's very interesting when you look at this. You look at, people always talk about the Nazi war machine, and it's something of a misnomer because, in actual fact, when you look at, so if you look at your Whitaker's Almanac, for example, it's very interesting in the 1930s. They have all sorts of sort of completely filled with information that normally you wouldn't particularly want, but in this particular case is very, very fascinating. So, for example, you can see how many vehicles there are, motorized vehicles there are per person in European countries. And I think the figure off the top of my head is 107 for Italy. So 107 Italians for every motorized vehicle, despite having Fiat and Alfa Romeo and all the rest of it. In Germany, that figure is 47, despite having Mercedes, Hawk, BMW and all the rest of it. In Britain, that figure is 14. It's 8 in France and it's 3 in the United States. So perhaps that's not surprising in the United States, but that makes France the most automotive nation in Europe and Britain the second most automotive nation in Europe. But Germany is actually languishing quite a long way behind. Where Germany is absolutely in the lead in the summer of 1939 is in radios. And some 70% of all households have radios, which is the highest percentage anywhere in the world, including the United States of America. And what they've done in the mid-1930s is they've developed what's called the Deutsche Kleinempfänger, which is this tiny, by the day, 9 inches by 4 inches by 4 inches, roughly. Bakelite, very cheap. And the point about this radio is that at the time, most radio sets were walnut. They were, they were lovely and wooden, and they were expensive, and they were kind of sort of middle class, upper middle class thing. They were an aspirational product, whereas what Nazi Germany does is make them an everyday product. What that enables you to do is pump out the same old nonsense over and over and over again. And yes, it is absolutely got lots of Hitler ranting and raving and all the rest of it, but it's also got lighter moments. It's got music, modern music, and Wagner, of course, and Strauss and everything else. But the overall thing is total control by the state, and it is a single message: we're great. Jews are bad, commies are awful, we're the best nation in the world, we're fantastic, come on Germans, get a bit of this. And that is the overall message, it just gets pumped out. But what it also, another byproduct of this, is the army sort of go, hang on a minute, we've got all these radio technology now, we have very small radios, that means you can put it in a tank, or a reconnaissance vehicle, or a truck, or even a groovy BMW with sidecar. And what that means is we can create an all-arm motorized formation, which has tanks in it and trucks and reconnaissance vehicles and motorized infantry and motorized artillery, and we can use them all together and they can then communicate. So all those problems that we had in the First World War, where you have a breakthrough but you can't reinforce that success because you have no means of communicating that, we can now do that, and we've got the Luftwaffe as well. And that is what wins them the battle in 1940, because what they're able to do is concentrate their forces, have that Schwerpunkt that I talked about, smash into the French. The French have very, very few radios. Their telephone, their communications are absolutely appalling. So badly so that at the Chateau de Vincennes, which is the headquarters of the commander-in-chief of all French forces, which is Maurice Gamelin, he doesn't even have a telephone in this building. And so what happens, of course, is the Luftwaffe come in, Stuka's dive bomb, They break lots of telephone wires. Refugees, which no one's thought about, suddenly clogging the roads. So you have to send off a dispatch rider. Because the French are so top heavy, they've got the overall armed commands, and then they've got army groups, then they've got armies, then they've got corps, then they've got divisions. And at every single stage, there isn't much filtering down of authority. So what happens is the orders have to come from the top to the army group, to the army, to the corps, to the division. And every single time you've got to send out these messages. And what then happens is you send off a dispatch rider from your army group headquarters to your army. He doesn't reappear at 12 because he's got stuck or shot up by a Stuka or a Messerschmitt or something, or just has got lost. So you then send out another one. You don't get his reply back till 9 p.m., by which time the whole situation's completely changed. And this has been continued down the chain of command. And so the net result is that the French are just immobile. They just can't organize anything. And what they hadn't planned was rapid mobile operations. They'd planned on a kind of methodical, you've got time to kind of build up your reserves, your mobile reserves, then counterattack all on your own terms. And of course, that doesn't happen. So that is the French failure. That is why the Germans get through. But it isn't because they're this huge mechanized Moloch, because they've got the most modern, bestest kit in the whole world or the best tactics. It's a combination of factors. So when it gets to the fall of France, and suddenly the Germans are feeling cock-a-hoot because they think, well, hang on a minute, we've just defeated France. You know, the British army scurried back. Britain's a kind of superpower, even though it's got a very, very small army. The Navy's called the senior service for a reason. And so what you've got is this situation where in Germany they're expecting it, you know, that is the victory, that effectively they've won, and that Britain is going to sue for peace because, of course, it's just lost its army. But it hasn't lost its army, of course. It's been evacuated, but it's lost all its kit. And then they're looking at it through the prism of their own narrow worldview, which is that the army is everything. Where, of course, in Britain, the army isn't everything. It's the navy and air power, which are the most important things. So suddenly they've got a problem on their hands because they've got to attack Britain by air first before they can even think about a cross-channel invasion. And yet their air force is designed to support ground troops, not to operate as a strategic air force on its own. So it's literally not set up in any shape or form to do that. Their intelligence is woeful. Their aircraft production has completely fallen by the wayside by this stage. It's completely overtaken to the tune of at least 2-1 by the British. And so the Battle of Britain, they're onto a kind of lost leader from the start, because they've also got to move all their airfields up to the Channel coast. That takes time because RAF Bomber Command and Coastal Command are coming over and harrying them every single day whenever the weather's fair. That means they've also got to have anti-aircraft defences. That all takes time. So they've got to build the airfields. They've then got to build up blast pens for their Messerschmitts or whatever. They've got to put in anti-aircraft guns and all the rest of it. All this takes time, by which, and while that time is going on, you've also got massive increase in aircraft production in Britain. So you've got a nation which is facing a battle that it is entirely prepared to fight and which it is ready for, which is Britain. You know, we have the world's first fully coordinated air defense system. The moment the Battle of Britain is lost to Germany, it's really up the creek, because suddenly it's like, yikes. Okay, we've conquered all these places, but actually the dividends that we've got as a result of that are not fantastic. By Christmas 1940, you know, they've been like kids in a sweet shop. The cupboard is bare. And they're thinking, what are we going to do? We haven't got enough food. We haven't got enough oil. We haven't got enough of anything. And Hitler goes, well, okay, it's clear. What we'll have to do is go into the Soviet Union. We'll have to go in. I know we were originally thinking about 1943, 1944, but we're just going to have to go now. I mean, you know, Soviet Union's had a bit of a bloody nose against the Finns. We've just defeated France. How hard can it be? Not realizing, of course, that the very advanced infrastructure of France is what has enabled them to have that rapid victory in 1940, whereas in the Soviet Union you're on a front of 1,200 miles rather than 220 or 120 or whatever, and there is no infrastructure, which means for their whole modus operandi, which is speed and speed of operations, that is going to grind to a halt very quickly if they don't completely beat the Red Army within about 350 miles of their start point, because then you reach what's called your culmination point. And your culmination point is when you can no longer do what you want to do because you can't supply your main effort in the same way that you would want to. And obviously in the vast Russian steppes or Ukrainian steppes where there's just absolutely nothing but endless nothingness, that is a major problem. And how do you maintain that speed of operations at the front when you're so far from your supply bases? And the truth of the matter is, They don't. So despite having these incredible victories in the summer of 1941, it all starts to ground to a halt because literally the wheels start to fall off. A lot of their mechanization, I should say, additionally, is half-inch stuff that they've stolen from France, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, Britain, left at Dunkirk and all the rest of it. They've got 2,000 different types of vehicles. And just imagine trying to be part of the supply chain, trying to be the quartermaster of that. You've got to have different distributor caps, you've got to have different gaskets, you've got to have different spark plugs. The whole thing just doesn't work. And so if they don't win in that quick time, in the time-honored fashion, very, very quickly, then they're stuffed. And that is exactly what happens in the Soviet Union. And what I think is absolutely unquestionable is that by November 1941, when it's clear that Barbarossa, the invasion operation of Soviet Union, has failed, that's it. And if you just take one arbitrary date, let's say for argument's sake, 15th of June, 1941, at that point, Nazi Germany and its Axis partners has got one enemy, which is Great Britain, albeit Great Britain plus Dominions and Commonwealth and all the rest of it. Fast forward to 6 months to the 15th of December, it's got three enemies. It's got the USSR with its infinite in Second World War times circumstances of manpower. The United States of America with its absolutely vast potential for war manufacturing, and Britain plus Dominions. Is it going to win from that point? I just can't see how it could possibly.
So on that note, I mean, Ben Ward asked a very interesting question about one of the things that the Allies did well, but perhaps the Germans didn't. Do you think adaptability might be in there, but also just on what you were saying there, the ability to form a coalition and put aside some pretty strong political differences, let's be serious, between Britain in particular and the Soviet Union? And do you think that that is a major reason for the Allies' success?
Yeah, I do. I think when you look at Britain, Britain is incredibly pragmatic in the Second World War, ruthlessly so. And yes, they do put a differences. There is this kind of sort of, and particularly that I think the British-American coalition, and it is a coalition, it is one of the strange paradoxes that they're known as the Allies, and yet they are actually just coalition partners. But it's an incredible coalition of extraordinary cooperation and collaboration. Yes, of course, people lose their tempers at time. Yes, people, curse the Yanks, curse the Limeys, all the rest of it. And of course, that happens. But by and large, it's an incredibly successful partnership. And actually, it works quite well with the Soviet Union because we let the Soviet Union get on with it in its own type of war on its own terms, which is largely a land war in which vast numbers of personnel are involved, which I would argue is not a particularly efficient way to fight a war. And we're able to let them do a lot of the hard yards so that they lose their young men so that we don't have to lose our young men. And we do that by supplying them through the Arctic convoys and all the rest of it. When you think of sort of, whatever it was, I think 11,000 Hurricanes were built in total, and of which about 5,000 or 4,500 of them went to the Soviet Union. It's quite a lot. I mean, 31% I think of tanks opposite Moscow in December 1941 were British tanks. Matildas, Valentines, not the best ever, but it still plays a huge contribution. And of course, the United States, Lend-Lease, and all the rest of it also plays a massive contribution. I mean, you can be quite cynical about this. I mean, America is in the war way before December 1941. It's not formally so, but it absolutely, it actually is from the summer of 1940, because that's the moment where Roosevelt goes, right, we need to help Britain, and we need to help Britain so that our young men don't have to do the fighting. The British can do that, and they're much more likely to be able to succeed in doing that if we can help them out with supplies. So that's the kind of the process, and that's how he turns America from in total isolationism onto a war footing. The U.S. Atlantic Fleet is operating in the Atlantic from kind of early September 1941, and indeed the Reuben James, the destroyer, is sunk in October 1941, so before Pearl Harbor. And ultimately, the moment it extends beyond the Battle of Britain, it is really a war of industry, mobilization, and production. And whoever can produce the most and mobilize the most is going to win. How long that's going to take and what the world is going to look like at the end, of course, that is all up for grabs. But I don't think the result is in doubt. The turning point is not Stalingrad. It's not Kursk. It's not 1943. It's way earlier than that.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating as well. Barclay Lane's actually picked this up in the comments, and a little bit from what you were saying there. Talking about the Soviet Union, because what does the Soviet Union bring to this partnership? It brings mass, just huge punching mass.
Yeah.
And so do you think that perhaps we here in Western Europe, probably less so now than during the wartime itself, but do you think we've almost forgotten a little bit of the Russian contribution to victory?
No, I don't think at all. I absolutely don't. I think we've almost, in the last sort of couple of decades, we've almost gone too far the other way. I mean, you have to be terribly careful not to assume that boots on the ground equals strategic importance. And I think it's worth actually, while we're on it now, just explaining that there are three levels of war. There is the strategic, the operational, and the tactical. And of course, you know all about this, Peter. But the strategic, obviously, is the overview. That is what you're trying to do. That is what you're trying to achieve. My strategy is get to Berlin, knock out the Nazis, or whatever it might be. Your tactical level is the cold face of war. This is, in its crudest level. This is your crew in its Sherman tank and the Lancaster bomber, chap in his Spitfire, infantry advancing over, out of their foxholes across the open ground. That is the tactical level. The operational level is the level that binds the two together. What enables you to achieve your strategic goals with the tactics of your choice. And it is a level in the narrative of the Second World War which has really been relegated, in a bad way. So most of the books that you will read over the last sort of 40, 50, 60 years, as well as documentary films and so on, what they do is they focus an awful lot on what's going on at the top, what Churchill's thinking, what Hitler's thinking, what the senior commanders are, Rommel, Patton, Monty, and all the rest of it, Eisenhower. There's an awful lot on the human experience of war, what Tommy Atkins is doing as he jumps out of his landing craft or whatever. There's been very little analysis of that operational level. And actually, once you reinsert the operational level into the narrative, a whole different picture emerges, because suddenly you realize that it's actually a war of nuts and bolts, and actually supply chains and supply lines. And there is, Britain never has more than a 55 division army, as you well know. And compared to the kind of 300, 490 divisions in the Red Army or whatever it is, I mean, just an absolutely extraordinary number. But again, I just, underline, boots on the ground doesn't necessarily mean strategic importance. And you can argue, and I think argue convincingly, that lots and lots of boots on the ground is a very inefficient way to fight a war, because all those men need feeding, which means more supply lines, which means you've got less to devote to ammunition. Much better to use mechanization and modernity and technology to do a lot of your hard yards for you. That's the whole point of Allied air power and British air power, particularly. I mean, British air power, the whole point of British strategy is use steel, not flesh, as much as they possibly can. And you have to say, broadly speaking, it's very effective and very efficient. But this idea that we're kind of this sort of bunch of sort of Captain Mannering, sort of Little Britain, bunch of amateurs, sort of backs against the wall stuff. You just need to kind of dismiss this. We're ruthless pragmatists. I mean, just take the example of food, for example. So in this country, in 1939, we produce around 14% of our daily food is home produced. And everyone sort of goes, well, hang on a minute, this is ridiculous. We've got quite a lot of farmland in this country. We can do an awful lot better than that. If we do better than that, that means we can free up shipping. And then we won't have to have so much shipping for food, and we can fill those ships with tanks and ammunition and shells and whatever. And so there's this complete agricultural revolution. What also comes in early 1940 is rationing, which gets tweaked as the war progresses. The whole point about rationing is it's not because we're short of food. It's to make sure that everyone has a decent meal. Everyone is decently fed in a balanced diet. If you feed everyone well, you don't have this disparity between classes. You don't have kind of poor working class people from Hartlepool surviving on bread and dripping. You actually have them having vegetables and fruit and meat and all the rest of it, and bread and cheese, just like everybody else. What you also do is make sure that those in the factories get a little bit more than everybody else. And so that means your productivity goes up because your workforce is healthier. And it means that everyone's in the same boat. So that also helps with this idea of unity and morale. It makes your workforce more efficient. And it means you've got less days for sick pay, sick leave. What it also means is you've got more shipping for other things. And by the end of the war, we're producing 91% of our own food, which is pretty darn impressive. And the whole Dig for Victory campaign is brilliant. It's the same as the NHS campaign now. I mean, it's stay at home, stay safe. It's the same principle. We're all in this together, and it's very clever, kind of manipulative kind of tool, but it really, really works. But this idea that we're on rationing because we're so hard pressed and we're so hard up and we haven't got enough ourselves and we're looking down the barrel is absolute nonsense.
I mean, on that note, you mentioned as well this idea of us as being enthusiastic amateurs, the British, and struggling. There's a great question from Alex Knight about the importance of Alan Brooke, for example. I mean, well, I rate Alan Brooke extremely highly, but perhaps you could share with the audience your opinions of him and his role in delivering victory overall.
Well, you've got all the competent nations. You need a political head and you need a really strong military head. The two need to work very closely in total collaboration and cooperation. We've used this phrase already in terms of the British and the Americans, but actually it's internal as well. Churchill, of course, is an incredibly strong character. He's an incredibly strong leader. He's absolutely bursting with energy, with ideas. We're incredibly lucky in Britain that we have a man who has such enormous geopolitical understanding. And I would also say that we're incredibly lucky that Roosevelt is president, because he is a man cut from the same cloth in terms of that geopolitical understanding. What do I mean by that? They have a worldliness. They have this. They can see the big picture. They have vision. And they have a vision that they can share not only to their subordinates, but to the wider public as well. So this is how we're going to do it. This is how we're going to make a way through. And I think that's incredibly important. What you've got with Churchill, though, is you've got an awful lot of mud being thrown at the wall and hoping some will stick. And it's pretty scattergun. He blows his top. He blows hot and cold. What you've got with Brooke is a really steady hand on the tiller. You've got someone who, again, is very calm, very rational, imperturbable, and is very able to deal firmly with Churchill. He's able to raise his voice to Churchill. He's able to put Churchill in his place, because in a way he's an equal. Although he serves as political master, he is the top man in the military. Churchill is the top political figure. Although strictly speaking, Churchill is above him in the pecking order. There is a kind of it's more nuanced than that. And Brooke just steers that very, very steady ship. I mean, he doesn't get everything right, of course, but he gets way more correct than he gets wrong. And his judgment and his assessment of other people, I think, is pretty much spot on. And what he also understands is this is a war the Britain is fighting this steel, not flesh war. It is fighting a war of operations. It is fighting a war where actually the most important thing is to kind of, build up that ground strength, harness air and naval power together, use the sea lanes to enable us to get to a point where we're not going to lose, and understand your own limitations. And I think all those things are kind of massive ticks in the box.
On the subject of Alan, I mean, in terms of wider British generalship, obviously we know about Montgomery as he's the forefront in sort of popular memory of the Second World War. Are there any other real sort of outstanding generals from the British side that you perhaps don't think are as well known as they should be?
No, absolutely. We're talking about army generals here, as opposed to kind of admirals or air marshals or whatever. I mean, I think by and large, what you've got is you've got a very, very rapidly changing situation. You've got new technology coming in all the time. You've got new tactics. The British Army of 1939 is not trained to operate in the Western Desert. It's not trained to operate in the jungle. It's not, it's not trained to fight at distance. It is not trying to fight the kind of, the all-arms motorized combination, even though the tiny British Expeditionary Force of 1940 is the world's first fully mechanized army in the world. It's a small entity. So inevitably, there's going to be some testing of the water. People are, commanders are going to have to kind of either step up to the plate or they're going to fall by the wayside. And so what you find in the first 2 years of war, particularly, is a lot of people just, they don't cut the mustard. They're not able to adapt. They're not quite good enough. And inevitably, they get the chop. What you've got to look at is what commanders you've got at the end of the Second World War, because those are the ones who either emerged in the early years or managed to stay the course. I do think Monty has been really unfairly vilified. I think people often conflate their dislike of his character with his ability as a general. And I think what he is a very good general at is he's not tactically, he's not up to much. He's not particularly imaginative. Operationally, he's absolutely brilliant. And actually, what we're fighting is that operational level is what's really key. How you manage your manpower, how you manage your firepower. And what they've developed, what the British develop in the middle part of the Second World War is a modus operandi, a British way of war. And it's broadly this: to use massive amount of firepower, use technology and machines as much as you possibly can to limit the number of those at the coalface. And you do this by probing forward with your infantry and with your armor, your tanks. And what they've discovered is that the Germans especially will always counterattack. It is a Malthusian, a sort of Pavlovian response to the situation that at a certain point, that is what German troops do. They get out of their foxholes, they get out of their camouflage position, they counterattack. At that moment, wham, down comes vast amounts of firepower from the air, from the artillery, from anti-tank guns, from the navy if they're within range. And that just attrits the enemy, it just grinds them down. What it does mean, of course, is that if you are unfortunate to be in the infantry or the tanks, your chances of getting through unscathed are literally zip. But the percentage of men which are infantry and in tanks in the British Army in the Second World War, and this also applies to the US Army incidentally, is really comparatively small, and very small compared to the German Army and very small compared to the Red Army. And it broadly works. So those generals that get that are the ones that are going to push on and are going to be successful. I am a huge admirer of Field Marshal Lord Alexander. I think he is a totally underrated genius of war. I mean, he's the most remarkable man. He's the only Allied commander. He's the only commander in the Second World War to have commanded troops in battle at every rank, from second lieutenant all the way up to Field Marshal. He served in the Northwest frontier he's an Irish Guardsman by origin. Very unusual for Guardsmen to end up in the Indian Army, but he does. He does a very successful stint in command of the Nowshera Brigade in the Northwest Frontier in 1936-37. He oversees the retreat across the Irrawaddy in Burma in May 1942. He then comes back, takes over as Commander-in-Chief of British forces in the Middle East. Is really the steadying ship before Alamein. He's the one who oversees all the resupplies. He supports Montgomery to the hilt. He's the one who first says there will be no more retreats. This is where we fight. He also visits Monty at the crucial moment between Lightfoot and Supercharge and changes the plan, suggests a subtle but very important change to Monty's plan, which proves completely successful. Then takes over as 18th Army Group Commander in Tunisia within 10 days of his arrival on the front in late February 1943. Everything has been brought back to sort of a decent situation following the kind of setback at Kasserine. Leads them to victory there, then leads them to Sicily, gets them through Italy, is commander of sort of 24 different nationalities by the end of 1944. He's really, really underrated. And I should also add into all that, he's also the last British soldier to leave Dunkirk. On the night of the 2nd of June 1940. So he's a pretty remarkable guy, and where he's really, really good is his diplomatic skills. His leadership qualities is one of, it's not barking orders, this is one of suggestion. So it's one of empowerment. And anyone who's ever had anyone working underneath them, everyone will know that it is really important to empower your subordinates. You need to make them feel good about themselves, give them confidence. So instead of saying, I want you to move that division up to the north, I like your plan, but it might be an idea to actually push them through there instead. What do you think? That is his approach. And it's just a different way. And sometimes that gets him accused of lacking grip. But overall, he's a great listener. He sticks to his guns, but so I think Alexander is right up there. There's some lesser generals like Francis Tucker, who is just the best army commander we never had. Unfortunately, he was struck by illness and all sorts of things. He commanded 4th Indian Division in the Western Desert later on in Italy. And he was just completely brilliant and never got, he ended up commanding a corps in India in the end of the, in Burma at the end of the Second World War, but he should have gone higher, but he was struck down by illness. And of course, there's Bill Slim, who is probably the greatest of them all, because I think the best generals are those that can fight on all three levels. They understand the strategic picture, they have a complete grasp of the operational level, but they're tactically innovative as well. And I think that's something that you can apply to Slim. He absolutely understands that operational level. He understands how to harness air power. He understands the importance of morale. He understands the problems, issues of supplies. He understands tactical training. He really, but he makes mistakes in the early part of the war in East Africa, for example, and again in Iran later on in 1941, before kind of really starting to pick up the pace in Burma in 1942, and then taking that on into 1943, 44, 45.
Can I just, because Drew's asked about that East Africa campaign and said, his question is about, do we know enough about the East African campaign, given how it tees up victory in North Africa and the Western Desert? Do you think there are, well, one, what are your thoughts on that? And two, do you think there are other campaigns that we perhaps overlook as we constantly get drawn into the bigger names when it comes to Second World War history?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the whole of our narrative of the Second World War is complete distortion because we're obsessed with the Battle of Britain and Normandy, and understandably so. We don't give enough recognition to the Battle of the Atlantic, which, in my book, I would argue is the most important campaign of the entire war, because supplies go for there, and if you don't have supplies, you can't fight a war. But of course, one of the things is to do with tourism in Hollywood. I mean, I know we've got Tom Hanks coming up in Greyhound, which is an adaptation of a C.S. Forester novel called The Good Shepherd, which is about the Battle of the Atlantic, and that's coming up any moment now in films. But basically, you've got to go back to the cruel sea in which we served before you've got a half-decent naval film. They just don't exist. And, part of that is because of tourism as well, because, you can hop on a ferry and go and see the beaches and walk on Omaha Beach and Sword Beach and stuff. You can't really kind of, you're not, unless you're sort of rowing across the Atlantic or something. And even when you get to the mid-Atlantic, what are you going to do? God, this is the point where kind of U-47 sunk X, Y, and Z. I mean, it's kind of slightly underwhelming. And ditto with the Far East. It's hard to get to Manipur State and look at Imphal and Kohima and Nagaland and you can't even get to the Arakan anymore because that's where the Rohingyas are and Rakhine State and all the rest of it today. So, these are factors, and very few people go to Madagascar. But, Operation Ironclad, arguably, it's a really, really important battle. Fought in kind of May 1942, denies the Japanese, denies the U-boats any access to the Indian Ocean, which means the supply lines through there continue up to the Middle East, from Australia to Far East. It's absolutely vital. And British capture of that from Vichy French ensures that we've got that foothold, that the Indian Ocean is secure and all the rest of it. So I would say that's massively underappreciated. All those battles in the Middle East, they're quite important for the North Africa battle. It's been overstated how important Middle East oil was in the Second World War, because most of our oil comes from the leading oil producers in the Second World War, the United States and the Dutch East Indies, what is now Venezuela, by a country mile. Then Baku in Azerbaijan is obviously the Soviet Union in the Second World War is the third. Middle East is kind of insignificant. The only importance from the oil fields point of view is that it supplies the British war effort in the Middle East. But if you weren't fighting there, you wouldn't need it. So, but even so, there were all these other little fights going on in Syria and insurrections in Iraq and Iran and so on, which are also incredibly important for securing that base in the Eastern Mediterranean, for making sure that the Germans don't get it, that there's no big link up down through the Black Sea and all the rest of it later on in the war. So, there's a whole host of things. But I think the most underappreciated theatre of the entire war is definitely the Atlantic.
Yeah, and I should say, so Drew has mentioned the British Pacific Fleet and the Fleet Air Arm, who, of course, operating out there. And they're a large part of the force preparing to launch the invasion of mainland Japan, for example. It's VE Day today, but as most of us know, the war continues in the Far East for a few more months yet. And so that absolutely, Drew, you're quite right. That is an important theatre of war that we shouldn't forget when we talk about this. We've talked a lot about the land operations, but as James has said, the Battle of the Atlantic is the most important theatre. And when it comes to the Second World War, we have to think about this in across the domains. Moving towards the concept of victory now and how that's achieved, Hugh Pearson has asked whether the victory in 1945 was an economic or a political victory, and I'm just wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I think it's both. I mean, Europe is absolutely shattered. I know we kind of sort of tend to think of the kind of post-war years here in Britain as kind of ones of austerity and actually increased food rationing and all the rest of it. But, obviously compared to kind of Germany or just about anywhere else, we were kind of sort of riding pretty. I mean, people also sort of get confused about sort of lend-lease and post-war loans, and the two are entirely different. So there was I think it was in 2008 that we finally paid off our wartime loans to the United States. They were actually immediately post-war rather than wartime. Lend-lease was lend-lease, and that was completely free. What is also interesting about lend-lease is it cuts both ways as well. So we were doing lend-lease to the Americans in the exact same way as they were doing it to us. So 31% of all US supplies in the ETO, the European Theatre of Operations, were British and British produced. So, it does cut both ways. Again, you need to kind of one needs to distance oneself from this idea that, it's all one-way traffic on this and dismiss this little Britain idea. Post-war, Britain, what you have to remember is the empire had already reached its zenith in the sort of late 1920s, really. There was a huge amount of agitation for kind of ending it before the Second World War. The Second World War actually prolongs the empire, not hastens its end. Although there are a number of overseas possessions which go because of the poverty, post-war poverty, such as Malta, for example, which is very much like Gibraltar or Falklands or any of these places which are still part of Britain, and part of British possessions. But we can't afford Malta in the 1960s and 70s, and so it goes. And obviously now as an independent part of the European Union, and fair enough. But a lot of these places, post-war, Britain, as I say, Britain's zenith has already peaked. I mean, everyone's broke by the Second World War, apart from the United States. So the rebuilding process is a long one, and there is no question that we suffer economically because of the Second World War. But of course, it's more than a price worth paying, because what's the alternative? I mean, there was someone on Twitter this morning sort of saying, is it just me? But does it feel a bit wrong to be celebrating VE Day, at this current time? And isn't it just an encouragement for nationalism? I would say no, not at all. I don't think being proud of what we did in the Second World War is nationalistic, and I abhor nationalism, but I don't think that follows at all. You have to remember that the alternative was a Europe that was dominated by totalitarian regimes and murderous, despotic regimes that wanted to limit our personal freedoms and inflict an entire Holocaust on a particular type of religious creed, as well as a whole host of other minorities. I mean, it really was worth fighting for. And the same applies to Imperial Japan with its absolutely abhorrent militaristic totalitarianism. The world is a better place for not having those. I mean, look how well Japan has thrived in the Second World War, because thanks to the Allies, its despotic militarism was overthrown. And the huge, vast suffering it imposed on China and other countries in Southeast Asia and beyond. Absolutely amazing. I mean, a lot of people don't realize this, but the two countries with the highest death rate because of the Second World War, one is Poland, which is like 1 in 5 killed of the entire population. The second is the South Pacific area of islands, where it's 48% killed in the Second World War, and that is because of the Japanese War. And then you've got, of course, you've got China, which is just, sort of 15 million dead.
Yeah, something that we I don't think really registers with a lot of people now. I mean, even the dates of the Second World War become an interesting point of contention if you bring China into the discussion. Abyssinia as well.
Well, I suppose so, but I think the point is that it is not a global conflict at that point. I suppose you can argue that it's a European war, but it does go beyond. It goes into Africa and stuff in the early years before it goes truly global with the entry of Japan. But I accept the arguments for saying that Second World War starts in 1937 or 36 or whatever, but I don't entirely buy into them.
So sadly, I mean, we have run out of time. I think, James, what we've covered there is in terms of the reasons for the Allies winning. It was the ability to production, logistics, leadership,
just better, greater efficiency. It's efficiency. It's what you see, generally speaking, with the Americans and the British is a really a broadly pretty efficient use of what resources they have, and really good prioritization of what assets they have. So they seem to kind of make the most of what they've got. Whereas what you see with Nazi Germany, and indeed, well, I suppose less so to a certain extent with Imperial Japan, but certainly with Nazi Germany, is you don't see them making the most of their assets. They seem to prioritize in an odd way. They don't seem to take advantage. The ideology gets into it. Hitler's influence gets into it all the time, and is constantly kind of putting a cat amongst the pigeons. And I think that is overall why once they don't win immediately, they're never going to win.
I think I've just been prompted by my NAM colleagues behind the scene, because this is going so well and because everyone's enjoying it so much. We're going to have one more question, which Ella Alderton has asked, and it was: how much did luck play a part in the Allied victory, and were the Allied forces better at seizing the opportunities presented to them?
Well, to answer the second part first, yes, I think they were. And I think that ties in with what I was just saying, to be perfectly honest. I think we were much better at seizing those opportunities. I don't think luck really comes into it. I think that luck is something where that can shift things. It can play a difference in terms of, when the outcome happens, or what the final situation looks like, but I don't think it affects the overall situation. The only thing I would say, and I think this is, and I don't really like getting into what ifs, I do think it's very interesting to consider what would have happened if Hitler hadn't imposed the halt order on the panzers on the 23rd or 24th of May or whenever it was, 1940. So what was happening was the BEF was at the point of being completely surrounded. The panzers from Army Group A, which were coming around the south, were poised to kind of meet up with the largely infantry forces of Army Group B, which is coming through Belgium. And at that point, there was growing concern that the panzer formations were actually getting ahead of the infantry divisions. What you have to remember is a panzer formation isn't actually full of tanks. It is an all-arms, combined arms force. And actually, they were doing just fine. And had they been left alone, they would have been all right, I'm sure. But Hitler intervenes because a decision is made about a reallocation of the panzers against his knowledge, without his knowledge, and he takes exception to this and thinks, no, I'm the boss man, I'm the daddy man here, I'm going to impose my will, so I'm going to reverse that decision. And it is all about subduing the command structure of the German army and showing that he is the man, not them. And just from that kind of ego power struggle point of view, it's not even a struggle, that imposition of his own power within his own armed forces, he blows it. Because as a result of that, Dunkirk happens, 338,000 men escape. And the closest Britain comes to losing the war is Monday, the 27th of May. And that is when Lord Halifax, who is the most respected politician in the country at the time, argues with Churchill and says, we should look into peace feelers. And he threatens to resign. And in the afternoon, after a particularly heated discussion in the War Cabinet, which is not in the bunkers, incidentally, if you've seen Darkest Hour, it's actually in the Admiralty and at number 10. Churchill takes Halifax into the garden of number 10. No one knows what he said, but what he does do is dissuade him from any further talk of resigning. Had Halifax resigned, that would have brought down the government. Had the government been brought down, it is, I think, much more likely that we would have sued for peace with Germany at the end of May, beginning of June 1940. And had the British army been completely surrounded, I suspect the pressure would have been overwhelming on Churchill as well. So I think that is the closest Germany got to beating Britain, largely through his own fault. He fails to kind of, and that is our good luck and his woefully bad decision making, which plays into our hand and ensures that we will carry on. There'll be no more talk of kind of peace. We will never surrender. We'll fight them on the beaches and all the rest of it.
Wow, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen at home, thank you so much for tuning in and supporting our virtual festival. Obviously, I know it's not ideal with the situation, but please, I hope you all continue to stay safe. But I also hope you continue to check in with the rest of the amazing program that my colleagues have put together. Tomorrow, we have a talk with Jonathan Fennell. But if you want to go out and do any more further reading on any of the things you've heard today, I will say one of the campaigns we didn't talk about is Sicily. James has a new book out about that in September, so do look out for that. But also you can find lots of other material online, both in James's books, but also on the NAM website. Thank you so much for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your VE days. Enjoy the rest of the virtual festival, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
Cheers.
Yeah, thanks, Peter.
Bye.